Okay.
Good.
Very good.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Thank you.
For Sisterhood Shabbat,
Yeah. And
Miriam's bat mitzvah was a good audition.
Yes, passed the audition.
Passed the audition test. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Flying colors. All right. So, time to get down to work. And we're going to start off with a little logical, Talmudical terminology. There's a phrase in rabbinic literature that's used for a variety of subjects called kal v'chomer. And kal v'chomer sort of literally means from light to heavy or hard. Light, not bright light, but light meaning sort of easy or simple. Mm-hmm. And the idea of a kal v'chomer argument is, we'll do it in good old English logic, right? If A is greater than B, right? If C is less than B, then what can we say about the relationship between A and C?
A is greater than C.
Very good. A is greater than C, right? If A is greater than B and C is less than B, then if you were going to make a list, of A, B, and C, you'd have A, B, and C going in that order. And this is just basically taking out B as the middleman. And a kal v'chomer argument basically says, if something is true for a difficult circumstance or an expected circumstance or the easy circumstance, then it should be true for the other circumstance because it's even more likely to be true in that case. Classic example, the prohibition of labor on Shabbat, right? We are told that we were not allowed to engage in the labor of building the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, on Shabbat. Kal v'chomer, if I can't build anything for the tabernacle, the most sacred construction project of all time, all the more so, I can't build my doghouse, right? If I'm not allowed to do it in the best case, then in a lesser case, certainly I can't. Make sense? Maybe?
Yes.
Maybe,
Yes.
Exactly. So the idea is that by using this type of argument, from the stronger to the lesser, right? If in the expected case it's A, then in an easier case it's going to be that, or vice versa. You're creating a parallelism and a hierarchy of expectation, and then you can make a logical conclusion. Sound good? Good. Remember that because we're going to need it in about 10 minutes. But keep your eyes open for where the kal v'chomer comes in this week's Torah portion, right? The kal v'chomer is going to sneak in. It's not that sneaky, actually. It's going to sneak in, and this is a case where the Torah explicitly makes one of these types of arguments. And we're going to have to understand it, because it's going to have a lot more to do with just than just with logic. It's got a lot to do with our spirit. Okay? So we are on page 351, Parashat Vaera, and that means we are on chapter 6, verse 2. Move that a little closer. My eyes are not what they used to be. Okay, so we're right up at the start, beginning. Does anybody remember the story so far? All right, so we just began the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, and God talked to this guy Moses and said, you got to go. Moses said, I don't think I can. God said, don't worry, you can. They'll believe you.
All the way at the end.
Just past Bernie Condit. There you go. He says, don't worry. I'll give you signs and wonders. This is what you say to them. They'll believe you. If you remember last week in our discussion, we talked about how God's name itself was an essential part of the proof. Moses went. Moses told the people. Moses told Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no.
I'll make it harder.
I'll make it harder. And things got worse. Right? So we're picking up just after things got worse. Just after the escalation. And that's our verse 2. All right? Good. I have a volunteer for... Okay, I got a volunteer for reading. I never want to presume, you know?
Kathy, would you like to? Okay.
Rock, paper, scissors.
God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord.
I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name.
The Yud Hey Vav
Yud Hey
Hey.
Vav Hey.
But remember, every time in this translation you see Lord in capital letters, that is their stand-in for Yud Hey Vav Hey, which is sort of what we discussed in last week's class. So this is coming back up, and in a way, you may notice repeating the initial discussion that God had with Moses at the burning bush that we talked about so much last week, where God really didn't reveal this name to all of the prior ancestors at this point. Instead, the appellation El Shaddai, right? God Almighty is often the translation, was what was used for them. And now God is doubling down on Yud Hey Vav Hey, on what we call Adonai, and saying, I know that things just got worse, and I know that people are upset, but I am. And see last week's lesson for a review of that. And he carries on to make good on the promise.
I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I, the Lord.
All right, so beginning with I, the Lord, and finishing with I, the Lord, we have this beautiful literary bookend system here. We have in between that 5 promises of redemption. And take away one that we now normally call the cup of Elijah. And that's why you have 4 cups at Passover, right? Because of these 4 promises, it's the last one. What's the last promise? A little bit before that, the land. I will bring you into the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. That's the last promise, and that's the one that we're not sure whether we're celebrating on Exodus or not, and why we wait for Elijah to tell us whether we should be drinking 5 cups instead of 4 cups. Right? That 5th cup on the Passover table, that's not for Elijah. That's for us. It's just we're waiting for Elijah to tell us if it is what we should be drinking that night or not. Is that 5th promise, the promise of being brought into the land, part of the Exodus, or was that a separate category altogether to be celebrated all separately? We're not sure. Teku. We let it stand until Elijah comes and clarifies it for us. And if he says, yes, that is indeed part of the full set of Passover celebration, then we do a Borei Pri Hagafen, and boom, 5 cups down, we're all happy. And if he says, no, that's a separate thing, then we say, oh, good, glad we didn't say a blessing over this, because otherwise it would have been in vain. Okay, so 5 big promises, 4 that we know get fulfilled in Passover itself, the other which takes a little bit more time to get to the land. And this is the restatement that God has just made after the failure of Moses' first attempt at talking to Pharaoh. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. All right, so we end up, and again, lovely JPS translation obliterates some of the nuances that we're going to unpack. Because if it says spirit crushed by cruel bondage, the Hebrew is more poetic, and poetry is the entry to deeper understanding. So the Hebrew actually says Kotzer ruach, right? Does anyone know what Kotzer, the root, might come from? Maybe you know some other words that are similar to it. Short. It comes from shortness, right?
Kotz.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Is that the Yiddish?
Yeah.
Okay, so it comes from the idea of shortness, and ruach, I make you bet many of you know. Spirit or breath. All right, so crushed spirit, your spirit's been crushed, short spirit. Yeah, we can see how they got to that translation.
Or short of breath.
or short of breath, right? Or it could just simply mean that they're, why would they be doing that?
They're working
They're
hard.
They're working hard, right? So are we talking about a spiritual deficiency? Are we talking about a emotional deficiency? Are we talking about physical problems? And then they say spirits crushed by cruel bondage, me'avodah kashe, but it's right? In the Hebrew, it's not by cruel bondage, it's and cruel bondage. So they would not listen to Moses from shortness of spirit, and cruel bondage would be a more literal or hard work or hard slavery, or however you want to translate that, would be a more literal translation, which doesn't sound natural in English, and it's not 100% natural in the Hebrew. And which is why we're going to spend the bulk of our time untangling that phrase, because it's got a lot there. We can just say, oh, they didn't listen because they were depressed. But it seems to be saying, at least opening up the possibility of many more options. Good, good, good. But we're not going to analyze it yet because we haven't found our kal v'chomer. We haven't found our logical a fortiori argument. That's the Latin version.
Yes.
Kal v'chomer is easier to say.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his land." But Moses appealed to the Lord, saying, "The Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech?" So the Lord spoke to both Moses and Aaron in regard to the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt.
Okay. I see you smiling and nodding.
Well, I'm taking it in a more literal sense. They didn't listen to him because they couldn't understand what he was saying. They were panting and working so hard. And so now we're going to have a mouthpiece.
Okay. But where's our kal v'chomer here?
Well, if the people wouldn't listen to me, more so why would Pharaoh?
Right. So if we're going to use the word Israel as the stand-in for the nation, right? If Israel was nothing, right? Was not listening. They were null. They were not getting the message. Then Pharaoh? Would you expect Pharaoh to be more or less receptive to the message than Israel? Even less receptive, right? Because our intuition tells us if the people of Israel, who were the ones who are in bondage and slavery and are most in need of redemption and getting out of the country, don't listen to a message of redemption and getting out of the country, then the guy who has everything to lose and nothing to gain certainly isn't going to listen to the message of getting out of the country, right? That makes sense. But does it? Right? I mean, can we really put these two in parallel? And why didn't the people listen to them? Listen to Moses? Right? The problem with this particular kal v'chomer is we have an explanation for why Israel didn't. And what's that explanation?
They're in bondage, they're out of breath.
This Kotzer ruach, right? This avodah kashe, this hard work, this shortness of spirit, breath. Is Pharaoh suffering from that?
No.
So maybe this parallel isn't so ironclad kal v'chomer.
Well, no, but Pharaoh is way above Israel. He's in charge of everything. Israel really has no power. Pharaoh has lots of power. Why should he listen to this kid who used to live in his palace and tell him what to do?
Well, this kid was 80 years old.
Yeah, this kid was, yeah. Yeah, but you know,
kids.
when you're a king, you always look down on them. But the problem is we have an abundance of information. If the Torah had simply said, but the people of Israel didn't listen and been done, this would be easy. Because then we all could mentally fill in the people of Israel didn't listen and Pharaoh even more so wouldn't listen, right? The people of Israel didn't listen and we can imagine why they didn't listen, and Pharaoh didn't listen, we can imagine why he didn't listen at this time. But we're told why Israel didn't listen, and that barrier to listening doesn't exist with Pharaoh. So we got to figure this out.
So Pharaoh's heart is
Pardon? Okay, well, not officially, kind of yet, sort of, maybe. I believe it was last year's class. I went over the whole hardening of the heart system, available on YouTube, without advertisements, or if you're not up for listening to YouTube, the handout is also available online for at least looking through the source material. But the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is a much more nuanced issue than just God kept him from doing it.
Yeah, Rabbi, I don't know if this has any applicability here, but what's coming to mind as you're talking about this is, when one has a situation of an abused child,
Mm-hmm.
an abused spouse, elder abuse,
Right.
right? Going to those individuals to try to say, look, you're not being treated properly. I want to intervene. It's not unusual for somebody to get a response of, no. It's like things are bad enough. If you try to do something, they're going to be even worse. And then in terms of then looking to intervene with the adult in question.
So if I can just make sure that everyone has the example of what you're saying, to sort of phrase it again, you're saying if you were go to, let's say, a spouse who's being abused,
Correct.
And you go to the spouse that's being abused,
Right.
and you say you gotta stand up, you have to leave, you
Right.
have to go to the authorities.
Let me help you with
Let me help you with this.
Right.
And they say, no, I can't listen to this. It's not going to happen.
Right.
Their Kotzer ruach, maybe they've been crushed. They've lost hope. There's, for whatever reason, they're unreceptive.
Right.
Then going up the chain of command
Right.
might be the next step, which is what happens here, right? God says, okay, the Israelites aren't listening. Go talk to Pharaoh. Right. Go talk to the abuser.
Right.
And see what you can do there. But again, would we expect the abuser to be more receptive than the abusee?
No.
Right? I mean, of course they don't think they're doing anything wrong. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
So at least the abuser might recognize that they're doing that something that's happening that's wrong. They just don't believe it can be solved, or that you can solve, or it might get worse. And in fact, in this particular case, remember, it did just get worse. That's going to be important in just a second. But we wouldn't necessarily expect you to go talk to the abuser. And yet that's exactly what God has told Moses to do. And that's exactly why Moses is freaking out. What good is that going to do? And we will come to a resolution. Whether or not you like it as the best resolution or not, well, that's why we have lots of different commentaries. But we will come to a resolution to that question. All right. Rashi.
Okay. If already they do not listen to me, how will Pharaoh listen to me?
Right, sort of a restatement of our verse 12.
This is one of the 10 Kal Vachomers, a fortiori, in the Torah.
Right, so Rashi points out from the Midrash that this is one of the biggies that shows you how Kal Vachomers work, right? The all the more so arguments work. If A, then all the more so C, right? If A if the ruling is this for A, then all the more so the outcome should be the same for C, because C is a lesser case or a better example or clearer cut, whatever. So Rashi's holding this up. But as we've just seen, on the surface, it doesn't make a perfect Kal Vachomer, right? It is, maybe yes, maybe no, but there's too much information that confuses it. So let's go ahead and see what some of our commentators do to help us understand this all.
They didn't listen because it did not appear believable to their present state of mind, so that their heart could not assimilate such a promise.
Make sense? Right? So what's this Kotzer ruach? What's this the shortness of spirit?
How are you going to believe that you're going to get us out of here?
Believability.
Come on.
Right? Just believability. Right? It's they couldn't believe it would happen because their spirit had been cut short. Their eyes weren't past their labor at the moment. They couldn't look up over the slavery and see that over there's this thing called freedom. It's their view was cut short.
I can't help but think of the parallel. If you had told a group of black slaves in America in 1850 that it'll be okay, one day one of you will be president of the United States, and it would be, come on. It's sort of parallel in you could sense how they would say, impossible. And the Hebrew slaves are saying, what do you mean we're going to get out of here? You'll talk to Pharaoh. Yeah, right.
But would it have been more or less likely than for Pharaoh to believe?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
What do you guys think? Would Pharaoh be suffering from the same delusion, the lack of belief, Or would he have more belief in its potentiality? Or would he have less belief in its potentiality?
Well, less,
Less.
because he's in power and he just would never see that he wouldn't be.
Okay, so one answer, and I'm going to push back on you in a second. One answer is that he would have less belief in its potentiality, because after all, he's in power. That's our gut telling us, people in power, they know they've got it made. What did Pharaoh do when he saw the people multiplying?
He enslaved them because he was afraid fear of
Right,
losing
he
his power.
enslaved them, he killed the children,
Yeah.
he has increased the labor upon these people. He is acting as though he believes he needs to take action to prevent this from occurring. If he didn't believe it was possible, he wouldn't bother upping the ante. He wouldn't bother killing the children. He would have just said, look, so what if we have more boys, more slaves to work for me? Who cares, right? It's great. That's good for me. But because he believes, too many guys with a sword, that could be a problem down the line. Because he believes that freedom is a potential, he acts, which means he has more belief in our potential freedom than we do.
Or he has less faith in his own power.
Which is very similar, because aren't we not believing in the potential of our freedom because we believe that Pharaoh will be able to stop us from being free?
Right, but he enslaves them prior to there even be a potential. It comes down to his belief in the strength of his own power.
But he thinks it could possibly happen. They think it can't.
Right. That's not to say that he's betting that it will happen. Obviously,
No.
he's betting hard that it won't.
It's possible.
And that's why we're going to be banging our head against him for a number of plagues. But he at least sees the potential, which is why he works so hard to prevent it.
Well, and I would think that also the following would speak to that, in that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is evidence in the Parshat
Mhm.
that Pharaoh recognizes the power of a supernatural force over him.
He is ambiguous at different points. Eventually, he does come to that realization. Eventually, and much of this story, ironically, is about the character arc of Pharaoh.
Right.
Much like, and you'll forgive my Star Wars fetish, much like the story of Star Wars is about Darth Vader more than Luke Skywalker.
Right.
The story of the Exodus is very much about Pharaoh and his realization and coming to terms with his own "I'm not really a god" idea.
No, agreed. The piece that I was thinking in terms of, though, and I may have this out of order, is when Moses comes to Pharaoh, excuse me, and says, in essence, "This is what my God wants."
Right.
Pharaoh does not reject the concept of his God out of hand. Instead, he says, let's have a contest, right? In terms of, he brings his folks in,
right,
which would seem to indicate that even though he may feel like he's going to win the contest,
which he clearly thinks he will,
right, but that there is the idea that there is an entity to compete with.
Correct. And polytheists throughout the ancient world, that was the basic assumption. Right? The basic assumption was there are lots of gods, lots of powers, lots of spirits, pick whatever term you want, and some of them are more powerful than others. And the more powerful ones are the ones you want to be following, because those are the good ones, right? Those are the gods with oomph. Oomph the god, that's temple to oomph. And that's why many countries, when they lost wars or were defeated, they adopted the gods of the conquering armies, because clearly the gods of the conquering armies were superior, otherwise they wouldn't have conquered. Judaism obviously rejects that notion. Pharaoh was still living with that notion. So, but at the moment, even when he is being demonstrated to be impotent in the face of God, he is being tenacious against it in very startling ways. Okay, next text. Let's see if Sephorna can try on part 2, maybe to get our head around this.
If it had not been for the heavy labor which they had to perform, they would have paid much more attention to Moses' words, and they would have understood that Moses' arguments made what he said very believable.
All right, so Sephorno is trying to take the 2 parts, right? Our Kotzer ruach, our shortness of spirit, our short breath, whatever you want to call it, and our avodah kasha, the hard labor. He's trying to say those are complementary, right? We've already have this short spirit, and the hard labor makes it harder for us to get out of it, for us to begin to see the believability. That there was an element of shortening us from the labor. So in some ways, he is agreeing with the JPS translation, that the labor exacerbated our lack of belief in the potential for our freedom. Notice, however, nowhere is Sephorno saying that the people didn't believe in God. They just don't believe they'll be free. So fine, like we talked about last week, Moses comes up and says, God exists. Okay, you're right. You're very convincing, God exists, and I'm still going to die a slave.
Well, there's also that there was this belief that there would be somebody would come to free them. Maybe they just don't believe it's Moses.
Possibly, although they may believe, if they remember well the prophecy that was given to Abraham, that they will eventually go forth. There was no necessarily statement about a particular redeemer.
Right.
So they may not even know what they're looking for. They may just be waiting for Egypt to collapse and then go. So the idea that they would leave at the height of Egyptian power, that they would leave when Pharaoh was adamantly opposed, they may not believe that. They may believe, yeah, one day, empires will fall and then we'll all walk out of here.
Right.
But to stride out, while Egypt is resisting, it's not going to happen. Just not going to happen. All right, let's try Rashbam.
Okay. Even though God said they would listen, they won't now, because they had expected some relief from Moses' first visit. Now they're working harder than ever.
Okay, so Rashbam again tries to reconcile these two different elements, the shortness of spirit and the hard work, of how are these working together. And he says this hard work is the new hard work, right? That the avodah they used to do, the making of the bricks, that was one type of work. Now that they're collecting the straw to use to make the bricks, that's harder hard work. And that is what is further exacerbating the problem. And their kotzer ruach, their shortness of spirit, is because they're not free now, right? You have this very interesting dynamic psychologically where if you have no expectations, you're not unhappy.
Mhm.
If your expectations are lifted and then dropped, now you're much more unhappy than you were before someone came and said you might be free. And so Moses came and said, all right, guys, all right, it's good to see you. God exists, hasn't forgotten you. I'm just going to go have a word with Pharaoh. When I come back, everybody be ready because we're leaving. And he comes back and he says, well, I've got some good news and bad news. The good news is he didn't kill me. The bad news is we're not going anywhere and you have to work harder. That, according to Rashbam, is the kotzer ruach. Their spirit had been cut short, right? That they had been blunted because they had been denied their freedom now. They kind of thought, hey, if this Moses guy is really telling the truth and has this power and God is really with him, then great. And now things are worse.
Yeah.
So when he comes back with this set of 5 promises of redemption, it's like, I've heard promises of redemption before from you yesterday. And now I'm picking straw. So no, I'm not listening. I'm not listening. Pharaoh more or less likely to listen under that mentality than the people of Israel.
Less. Way less likely.
Because?
Because Moses says he'll do this and he has the power to make it even worse for the people. He has all the power. He says, every time you tell me to do something, I'm going to make it even worse. And
So,
well, that'll stop you.
so in many ways, Pharaoh has been validated,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Let my people go. No.
Right.
Okay, they're still here. So I guess when I say no, it works, right? So he has in some ways been validated in his ability. So perhaps we would then say, in this case, that the Kal V'chomer does stand, that the people who have every reason to hope to go may have had their hopes dashed, but at least they still have hope that it might work. But Pharaoh, who has seen that he has the power to stop them, is going to double down over and over again. Every time he realizes he has that power, it's going to make him harder and harder to move. I think we even call that about the hardening of his heart, right? It's when you realize your position is working, you stick with it right up to the point where it stops working and people start dying.
And they're going to believe less and less every time. He's going to believe more and more because he has that power. And every time something even worse happens, they're going to believe less and less.
Okay, so we can see that maybe the Rashbam is reconciling this for us.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of behind the scenes.
Go for it.
question. Where were they putting all these bricks that they needed so many?
Well, they were building
Cities.
huge constructions.
Cities.
These were like adobe bricks,
They
made
were
from.
not for the pyramids. were
No.
they?
The pyramids are made of stone, not of brick.
No, I know, but
And the pyramids
I
were
thought that
already,
They were working on the pyramids.
no, the pyramids were already old by the time of our
really?
enslavement. They were already like 1,000 years old.
Oh.
Egypt has had a very long history. But the cities, the granaries, those were what were being
Other
built
buildings.
by these mud adobe bricks. I mean, it's a very good system of building bricks. That many of these buildings are still there. Yay, Jewish craftsmanship. But yeah, they were not the
They had
pyramids.
been around for so long, and they were still building more buildings.
Yeah,
Well, they kept having more people. The Egyptians have more people too. They need more.
Multiple
I don't know if you've noticed, but we keep building stuff too. I mean,
tearing down.
you're tearing down and building up, tearing down. I mean, you have to keep building. It's what civilizations do. I've never seen a civilization yet that said, "Okay, guys, that's enough.
That's enough.
Let's all go down to the beach." Okay. Ramban has his own opinion.
It's not that they didn't believe,
Oh dear. So he disagrees with Sforno.
but they literally wouldn't listen because their spirits had been crushed by the exile and hard work imposed on them. Like a man so crushed that he doesn't want to live an extra minute, even though he knows there will be some relief. The hard work meant they had no time to think.
All right. So again, he wants to get both of these components in. The hard work. Okay, they had no time to think about this. What is it that they're not thinking about? There will be relief. But imagine you are a slave and your life is so bitter and so horrible, and someone says to you, you could die now and be done with this, or you can go on slaving for another month, year, 10 years. Eventually you'll get out of this. Do you really want to go through it? How many people, when they go through severe and difficult medical treatments, think to themselves, I know the doctor says this is going to cure me, but another month of this, another treatment of that, and I might as well, put me in the ground, even if it's going to get better down the road. That's the Kotzer ruach, the shortness of spirit. Again, I can't live for tomorrow if today is too painful. And that is what Ramban is saying, kept them from even hearing. Because what he's picking up here is this wonderful word, shama, in Hebrew, means listen and
Here.
hear in the sense of obey, right? Shema means to hearken to. It would be the best English word, right? When you hearken to someone's voice, it means I hear them and I'm going to do what they're telling me. And that's what Shema really has as an element. It's both hear, meaning let the sound hit your eardrum, and hear, meaning do it. And what Ramban is saying is that Sforno was arguing that they didn't do the second part. They heard the words, they just couldn't take them to heart. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't do that because that wasn't going to happen in their mind. Ramban is saying, no, they didn't even get to the point of thinking about it. They just couldn't even hear the words because of how horrible the life was. And don't tell me it's going to be better tomorrow. I can't even hear that word. It just makes no sense. It's like, murr, 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 murr. It's just noise. It's not even words. Right now, life is too horrible for me to even consider life being anything else. Think of how bitter that is. Think of how horrible the life would be. I mean, like I said, for most of us, the best we can come to is an approximation from going through a horrible medical procedure. Or maybe somebody who we might know that went through horrible depression. This can't even hear the words of hope or freedom or better or well or happy. The words don't even register in the brain anymore. That's what Ramban is saying is happening here. Pharaoh, more or less? How does he fit then into our Kal V'chomer? If Israel isn't listening because they can't listen, because their life has been made so horrible, can Pharaoh listen? Is his life so horrible that his ears don't work? No, he should be able to hear just fine. So Moses should be able to go to Pharaoh and say, let the people go, and Pharaoh should be able to reasonably weigh the pros and cons of this idea and make a good decision based upon it. And yet he doesn't.
Well, if he was to hear and obey Moses, his life would be miserable. He wouldn't have slept.
Well,
He'd have a lack of power. He will have been.
He would have been diminished.
Diminished
Yes.
in front of his own people.
Correct. having nothing would be a stretch. Although we could argue that,
Well, not having slaves.
Right.
You know.
but you could argue if you did want to push, actually, it would be something he couldn't hear. You know, the idea that his life had been made so grand, the opposite of the Israelites, that he couldn't hear the word, not freedom for them, but limit for me,
Yes.
right? Less for me. You keep saying that I should do less. You keep saying I should be nice. I don't understand those words. Those words just, they don't make any sense to me. And what Ramban is saying is that these people, Pharaoh and Israel, their life had been so colored by their experiences that the words didn't even register anymore. It wasn't that they took them in, mulled them over, and then rejected it, which is sort of what Sforno was saying. It's, I just don't even know those words.
Not part of my vocabulary.
Exactly. It's, you keep on saying that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. To quote Princess Bride, it's just the word didn't even get past the eardrum. It was just so much noise, not even a word that they rejected. It was just bouncing off like the sound of a car going past. Okay. But there's another way to look at this, as there always is. Okay, so we're going to see a couple little short explanations, and then we're going to try and put them together. So one from Ikar Siftei Chachamim.
Moses didn't know why they didn't listen to him.
All right, so the Kal V'chomer is predicated on, our problem with the Kal V'chomer is predicated on the fact that we got too much information. They didn't listen to him because shortness of spirit, hard work, right? That's the narrator talking. Did Moses know why they didn't listen?
Well, he assumes they didn't listen because of his impeded speech.
When Moses talks about going to see Pharaoh, he tells God, I can't talk to Pharaoh. They wouldn't listen to me. Why will Pharaoh listen to me, a man who has these uncircumcised lips, which is a thick lips that don't work properly, is kind of what he's trying to say there. I just blah, blah, blah. I'm not a good speaker. So Moses assumes that they didn't listen to him because he wasn't eloquent enough. Think of how sad that is, right? He's not seeing that the reason they're not following him is because what has happened to them spiritually and physically and emotionally. He just thinks, oh, I didn't do a good enough job with my speech. If I'd done a better speech, they'd all be following right now. That's sad, isn't it? That he completely misses what is actually happening. So his Kal V'chomer is legitimate in this idea because he thinks they should have listened to me and been more generous to me despite my speech deficiency. But Pharaoh has even less reason to be generous or comfortable or willing to look past my speech impediment. Therefore, he's even less likely. I'm going to be even worse when I talk to him. So in this way, the Kal V'chomer is perfect in Moses's mind. It's just the Kal V'chomer doesn't work for the reader because we have too much information.
It's interesting. My first thought is that this is the start of Moses' education. You know, he really has no idea what their life is like.
Yeah.
He did not experience this at all. And he's very egocentric at the moment. They didn't listen because of me, because of, you know, he just doesn't have any
Empathy for them.
empathy.
That's right.
He doesn't get it.
Why don't the sheep follow me? Because I'm not shepherding them properly.
Me, it's about
Why?
me.
Right. Why don't the people follow me? Because I'm not shepherding them properly.
And why do you want me? I am the least qualified person.
Exactly, because the main way to get people to follow you is by giving a good speech, right? And that's what seems to be the problem. And I'll tell you that as a rabbi, especially when I was freshly minted, this is a very real idea that people who work in these sorts of positions, not that I'm a Moses, but people who work in a position of trying to influence, encourage, inspire, and teach, really very much feel, which is, if only that sermon had been better, then I would have been able to transform their lives. And eventually you have to realize that you are one part of their life, usually a small part, and you can give the most brilliant, best, objectively wonderful sermon ever, and they're just not ready to hear it. They're just not ready to hear it. And it's not about you. It's not about you. So absolutely, I agree with you. This is part of Moses' education, which is why Ralbag's comment, I think, is so brilliant.
The Kotzer ruach refers to Moses, not the people of Israel.
Now, this is hard grammatically, because it means you're switching back and forth between an adjective for one person and then an adjective for the group of people. but it can work. But the insight, I think, is very good. Moses tried to get the people to follow and come, and they didn't. And now he's saying, okay, fine, I'm done. I've given up. And when we read Rabbi Hirsch's comment about what Kotzer ruach can also mean,
Kotzer ruach is impatience.
this shows impatience, it says, right? He goes, he tries, it didn't work, I'm going home. Right? Why should I bother trying on anyone else? That's a Moses failing. That's a shortcoming, because he gets over it. I don't want to call it a failing. But he expected a miracle. Right? God told him, go free my people. He went and said, guys, we're here to be freed. And they went, yay. And then Pharaoh went, no. And they went, oh. And he went, okay, I guess I'm done.
Yeah.
You really were expecting it to all happen like that? Is that what you thought when God said, you will take my people out? That it would really be just snap of the fingers, everyone would fall into line? And when it didn't happen, do you really just think it's because your lips are too thick? That's the problem? Moses has to learn what it means to lead. And he's learning patience, and he's also learning that it's not all about him. But patience appears even as a general word, even if we want to take the Kotzer ruach as applying to the entire nation rather than just Moses, appears to be a bigger issue, a bigger trait. And that's where the next Rashi comment from the Midrash comes in.
Impatience of spirit. When someone is upset, their spirit and breath are shortened and they cannot breathe deeply.
Right, so they're taking it literally in both the spirit and breath side. Right, you're not thinking, you're hyperventilating, you're not good for rational thought.
Similarly, I heard this explanation from Rabbi Baruch, son of Rabbi Eliezer, and he brought me proof from this verse from Jeremiah. At this time, I will let them know my power and strength, and they will know that my name is the Lord. We learn from this that the Holy One, blessed be He, fulfills His word. Even when it is for punishment, He announces that His name is Lord.
Sorry, there should be a period there. That's an important period. Hold on, so let's make sure we understand that sentence. We talked a little bit about the word Lord, right? Yud He Vav He last week. And hopefully you remember from other times we've studied or from other places you've learned, usually when we see that word Yud He Vav He, we are thinking of God in the aspect of compassion, of mercy, of kindness, as opposed to Elohim, which is usually used more in phrases and verses that have to do with God's judgment or strictness. And what Rashi's rabbi is telling him, or what he's conveying that his rabbi told him, is that even in this verse from Jeremiah, where God is talking about a punishment, he says, my name is going to be aspect of kindness, right? This aspect of good. So in punishment, people should understand that God is still God and that God is still good and kind. All the more so, right? Kal v'chomer, how much more so?
Even for punishment, how much more so when He fulfills His word to do good?
Right, so if God's ultimate essence is good, so much so that even when He's punishing, He's still good, He's still merciful and kind, then when God promises to do something good, all the more so you should believe that that will come to pass. Patiently. Right? Because if you believe that that is God's essence and that that is the essence of God's promise, then the fact that it hasn't happened yet shouldn't discourage you. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Wonderful thing, with gravity as an example. When I let go of this pen, there will be a fraction of a second where it is moving too slowly for my eye to see. If I was better at seeing things quickly or had a slow motion camera, I could stare at a, picture of the pen hovering there going, why doesn't it fall? Why doesn't it fall? It is falling. You just don't notice the movement yet. Eventually, yes, it'll be moving fast enough for you to detect. But for a moment, it looks like nothing's happening. But if you know gravity, if you know God, then you know where it's going, right? You know that the promise will be fulfilled. You're just impatient. The people thought they'd be delivered in a moment. Moses thought they would be all instantly, set free by his wonderful speech. And it didn't happen. Nah, that's the Kotzer ruach, according to this drash. And they're going to drive that point home and link it to the beginning of our chapter.
And our teachers taught with regard to the above, that when Moses said, why have you harmed?
Remember when he says, why'd you send me? It's all worse now.
The Holy One said, alas for those who have been lost and cannot be found.
Dummy.
I must mourn the death of the patriarchs. Many times I revealed myself to them as Almighty God.
El Shaddai.
And they never said, what is your name? But you asked, what is his name that I may tell them?
Anyone?
Yeah.
All right. So every time God went to the patriarchs, remember we saw at the very beginning of Vaera, he said, I revealed myself to them as El Shaddai. And there's an implicit quote or criticism, says this Midrash, and they never asked for more. They were good with that. When I said I'm El Shaddai, they were like, okay, good, thank you. And you've promised me this, you've promised me that. Oh, look, I have to flee the country because of my brother, or there's a famine. Oh, okay, it's okay. You're El Shaddai. I'm good, I'm good. He's going, what happened to those guys? Because I'm telling you, they're great grandkids down here in Egypt. I say, I am here, El Shaddai, and they say, oh, so what's your name? I just told you I'm El Shaddai. Why do you need to know my hello, my name is? All right, fine, my name is. But why are you so impatient? Why don't you just trust that this is going to happen? Why is your spirit so short? What's this Kotzer ruach? And so God is getting frustrated with both Moses and the people, because after all, it was Moses who asked, what is your name? So this is, I think this is a brilliant Rashi for bringing back in both of those elements of who was the shortness of spirit that was causing this problem, Moses and the people. They were both impatient. Moses expected immediate results, and the people expected things to be better instantly once he had come the first time. And both of them were disappointed, and both of them were just about ready to walk away from the whole thing.
But it also sounds as though God was impatient.
Well, God is frustrated. I will slightly modify that in the sense that if the people were patient and if Moses was patient, he wouldn't be having to go through this explanation with them. I told you I was going to do this. Well, why are you asking me about when I'm going to do this? Right? It'd be like if you were to ask me to trim your hedge, right? And every 5 minutes you're going, so have you trimmed the hedge yet? Have you trimmed the hedge yet? Have you trimmed the hedge yet? Like, you don't trust. I said I would do it. Right? Do you really need to ask me over and over again why the hedge isn't trimmed? I said I would trim it. It will get trimmed. This is not a catastrophe that has been delayed 5 minutes. That's the frustration God is expressing in this midrash, which is really meant to be a frustration that we're supposed to feel when reading the story and then transpose into our own hearts. Are we impatient? Do we demand too much of ourselves or of others? Do we expect our actions to have immediate results, and when they don't, are we like Moses and say, oh, well, I guess I'm just not good enough to do this? Or do we expect results from other people, and when they don't immediately follow, we go, oh, well, I guess they just, can't rely on them for anything.
I think it's an individual situation. Some of us become very impatient and expect immediate response, and others not like that.
Absolutely. And I think that the lesson that the Midrash here is trying to have us see through this story in the Tanakh is that's not a good spirit. Right? Expecting immediate results from other people, from ourselves, and from God, that's Kotzer ruach. That's a shortness of your spirit. And that's a problem.
Yeah, this concept is one of the main principles of AA, NA, and 12-step, in that when somebody first stops using the substance that they've been using,
Right.
it is not that uncommon for somebody to say, gee, I thought when I stopped drinking,
Right.
everything was going to get better.
Right.
And what a sponsor or somebody else in the fellowship will often say is, look, these things happen in God's time, not your time. And that is a staple statement that is really embraced by people who have successful recoveries.
Right. Because if you expect, okay, I stopped using now, where's my better life?
Right.
There's a problem. And the problem again is the expectations go up and crash. They get dashed, and then you're much lower than you were when you started, and now you're more likely to go back to the abuse. Exactly. All right. Comment?
I guess I'm kind of confused by why would we think that God was impatient? I don't see that part.
So good. Because God isn't actually impatient, right? And God isn't actually frustrated.
Right.
God doesn't actually get angry. God doesn't actually get happy. because God does not have emotional states that change from one moment to another. Very, very true. But imagining it so for the sake of revealing something about ourselves and our communities is a tried and true method of Midrash and Tanakh and the Bible itself. So when it says that, God was angry at the Israelites, or God was angry at so-and-so, or God turned his face away from, God has no literal face, God has no literal emotions, but they are meant to help us reflect on what that would be like if it were a human situation. If we had betrayed a human the same way, if we had disregarded a human's instructions the same way, what would the human respond to? And we might be more sympathetic to the human response than we are to God's response. Because unfortunately, as you may have heard some people say, if God is infinite and great and timeless and all of this, then what difference does it make whether I'm good or bad? Sometimes when we think about God honestly and realize that God isn't happy, sad, good, bad, frustrated or impatient or whatever, sometimes it allows us to almost not care what we should be doing, because God doesn't care literally. God's not happy when I'm doing something good and angry when I'm doing something bad. God is God, and I can't affect God. So if I can't affect God, why bother being good? Is unfortunately a logical fallacy that follows from that. So when we describe in the Midrash or in the Torah of God having emotions or being impatient or being frustrated, it isn't trying to teach us something about God, it's trying to teach us something about us through the vehicle of the situation. And yes, that can create theological problems if you push it too far. Thank you for bringing us back a little bit from the edge of saying, no, God isn't actually frustrated. It's just an expression of frustration. And that expression of frustration is very important for getting to grips with the underlying question of all of this, which is, why didn't they just go?
I guess the thing is, I told them Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, El Shaddai, and
they jumped in line.
But I see the entire Torah as this progression of human spirit getting more, getting away from that
jump in line,
right, and developing and talking with God and moving mankind forward to a better place. So, if he wants to pretend to be frustrated with Moses and then go off into his room and say, "Oh, they're really doing great. They're really good." Just like a parent, like question, but you're happy
that they're asking the questions.
Yeah. Exactly.
So definitely there's some of that. What I would add though is that in this particular case, what God is trying to set out, what God is trying to achieve with the Exodus is more than just freeing the slaves. He is trying to make an indelible mark on the mind of humanity that there is a God, that God cares what the world looks like in terms of our moral choices and our actions and how we shape our lives, and that God is willing to help us influence history to move in that direction. And they didn't move an inch. So we should be frustrated on God's behalf. We should feel, well, if it were me, I would have done that. Not that I wouldn't argue with God or question or analyze and understand in deeper levels all of the mitzvot and how I should be living, but something so obvious of take them from suffering to freedom. They should have jumped. I should jump. And I should feel frustrated with them, because that will make me less likely to follow their example and more likely to do what they should have been doing, which is going. Which is going. And we're going to get that in spades in just a minute.
They did not obey him to mentally absorb all this so that they would have full trust in the salvation of God and give him credit for this. This is where they were different from Abraham in his time, who believed implicitly in an impossible sounding promise and who gave credit to God for making such a promise. This was eventually the reason why this part of God's promise was not fulfilled in the lifetime of the people who were being addressed at this time.
All right, so this is where the implication comes in, where their response matters. Right? It's not just they didn't move. It's because they didn't move, they didn't achieve as much progress in the world as there was supposed to be. And what's the part that wasn't fulfilled in their lifetime?
given to them.
Exactly. Remember, 5 promises of redemption,
Right.
and the people don't listen. And what Sforno was saying is that 5th promise, they missed out, right? And we can see that not just in this episode, but repeatedly, this is the attitude of this nation, this generation at this time, which is they kind of follow, but they also don't really believe it's possible. They don't really believe it can happen. And that Kotzer ruach, that short-sightedness or that impatience, they don't wait for Moses to come down. They're grumbling about the water. They want more meat. They don't believe the spies. Again and again and again, they show as a pattern. And what Sforno is saying is it began right here, right? Yes, we get bigger examples of this spirit or Kotzer ruach later, but right here is our first example of the attitude this group is going to have, and Moses to a degree himself, that's going to keep all of them, Moses included, from getting into the land of Israel. So that the 5 promises that start off this chapter become 4 in terms of fulfillment. That 5th one, taking the land, needs our spirit to be fully believing that it's possible. Because it does still sound impossible. And you all, I'm sure, remember the wonderful line, im tirtzu, enzo agada. If you want it, if you really believe it, enzo agada, this is not a myth. Right? And that was the Zionist song, that if you want it, Israel is not just a dream. If you think of it like a dream, it will remain a dream. Yes?
Well, Abraham, comparing it to Abraham, he's in a whole different situation than these people. These people were slaves for, I don't know how many years, 250 years.
Very true.
Abraham never faced that situation.
No, he faced worse, spiritually, emotionally, right? He had no example. He had no one who had a promise fulfilled for them by God. He lived among idolaters of, the most prolific kind. And he was being asked to leave behind a comfortable, fine life and go to a place where he was supposed to have, but no one would recognize his claim on the land. Whereas these people are being taken from nothing and given everything. And they've had evidence for their ancestors that God makes good on these promises. So in many ways, yes, Abraham was more blessed by not having been a slave. And maybe that's why the hard work part gets put into this line of why their spirit was so short. But in other ways, Abraham was a true pioneer. He was someone who was a spiritual groundbreaker. And that is a much harder job than walking the trail afterwards.
Oh, yeah, but he didn't have that spirit of being a slave.
And again, that comes back to what is the spirit that's being cut short here? What is it that made it so hard for them to accept a promise that was so good, so tempting?
Well, if they lived their life in such bleakness
Mm-hmm.
and desperation, they didn't even know what light is.
Okay. So this wonderful word ruach, right? This spirit that we're getting back to. I wanted to show you a couple other examples of it from Tanakh, because it comes up quite a lot. The most famous and most important for our conversation comes in the 2nd verse of the entire Torah, right? V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, right? The spirit of God, the ruach of Elohim, hovers on the surface of the water. This is the very beginning metaphor of creation, of God hovering at the beginning when the universe is just being formed. When we talk about ruach, we have to always harken back that what is the ultimate source of the ruach of the man, of the person, of humanity? It's God. And so when we say our ruach is kotzer, the ruach is shortened, is limited, is impatient, it's not just talking about shortness of breath or shortness of temper. It's also talking about a shortness of our connection and understanding to God, right? One of the reasons why they may not have believed what was possible was because they had stunted their connection to God so much they didn't understand what God truly stood for. And they didn't realize that redemption was built into godliness, to God's design for the entire universe. And so therefore it doesn't look so possible. And if you don't understand that God could no more fail to redeem you than God could fail to create the universe, then it seems like God's going to make a try at redeeming you. You have to realize, no, it is built in from the moment of creation to this moment that you will be redeemed, because it is the same ruach that is doing it. One person who could see what God was about and what was happening was our good friend Joseph, right? Because how is he described by Pharaoh when he is so impressed by Joseph's dream and ability to plan for the future to rescue the people from famine? He says, you know, "Hanimtza kazeh ish asher ruach Elohim bo." Right? Can you find anyone like this guy who has the Spirit of God in him? Right? What did Joseph do to earn the title Spirit of God?
Who interpreted the dreams?
He interpreted the dreams to say what?
The famine that was going to come and how he could fix it.
How you could fix it, right? It wasn't just that he interpreted the dreams. Remember, that's very important for the Joseph saga. He doesn't just say there's going to be plenty, there's going to be famine. He says there's going to be plenty, there's going to be famine, and this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to make sure people don't starve to death. This is how we're going to redeem the country. Remember, redemption in Jewish always means an end to suffering, right? An end to physical suffering. This is what we're going to fix. He understood God. God does not want people to suffer.
But isn't it an incredible thought that Pharaoh would listen to what Joseph had to say?
Absolutely. And we should be thankful that that Pharaoh did listen for whatever reason, and we can argue about that. But this is a new Pharaoh, the one that Moses is dealing with.
Yeah.
And so he's got a different Pharaoh that he has to convince. And this Pharaoh doesn't seem to recognize Ruach Elohim all so easily. Sarah, you had your hand up.
I don't see the word hope anywhere over here for the people.
Mm-hmm.
Hope. And what about the younger people, the young ones, you know?
Well, you need to have
Didn't
hope.
they follow Moses?
But to have hope, you have to have both a understanding of what it should be and a belief that it can be, right? So either you don't know that it should be, meaning you don't understand God well enough to know what goodness is, to what goodness looks like. And you may think this is just the normal way the world works. There are pharaohs and there are slaves, and that's just how it is. So why should I be upset? Why should I be angry? Why should I even hear the word freedom? It doesn't make sense in my world. Even if you do see that there should be goodness in the world and that this is not it, you then have to have belief that there is a power that can make that happen. And on both fronts, I think our commentators are saying that people are lacking that insight.
Flashed in my head that the shortness of spirit relationship that we're looking at between the slaves and Pharaoh is not between the slaves and Pharaoh. It's the slaves and Abraham and Pharaoh and the previous Pharaoh who recognized God in Joseph.
Right.
And now this one sees nothing.
Right. Very interesting parallel. I like that the slave generation is as diminished in their ability to recognize God and God's spirit as Pharaoh is diminished in his ability to recognize. It's both generations have diminished.
Right.
And the implication is more suffering for both sides, because there's more suffering for the slaves, obviously.
And it's an inverse of their power. Joseph had tremendous power.
Right.
And now Pharaoh has tremendous power and the people have
Very good. Yes.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, Management 101 is don't just bring me a problem, bring me a proposed solution.
Yes.
Right? And maybe this is being too positive or too favorable to the current Pharaoh, but in fairness, Joseph brought that other Pharaoh. He said, look, we're going to have this situation. Here's how we're going to fix it. Moses did not say to this Pharaoh, we're going to free your entire workforce, but here's how we're going to substitute a workforce for you, right?
Okay,
That's not
well, hold on a second, because
okay.
actually I want to make a quick point, then I want to finish up our comments, because I know that we're running over, but Moses did actually propose something that was infinitely fine. When Moses first comes to Pharaoh, he does not say, liberate these people and set them free.
He says, let them go and pray. They'll be back in 3 days.
Let them go and worship God. And they'll be back, as you said, in 3 days. Right? He says, and you can see then, if you have this interpretation, that Kotzer ruach is not just impatience, not just anger, not just tiredness, but that it's also their ability to connect to God has been stunted. What he's asking for is, let me take them out, let me grow their spirit, right, through worship, and when they come back, we'll talk. Right? He is offering an intermediate step, and Pharaoh rejects that and makes things worse. Right? And he doubles down on being a jerk, basically. So there is Moses offering that, and Pharaoh still doesn't see it. Because, you know, as you say, Management 101 or 201 is never give a sucker a break,
Mhm.
right? Why do I need to be good if I don't have to be good to them, right? If I can drive them into the ground, I'll just keep driving into the ground. What's going to stop me? You? Well, yeah, actually, in the end, that is what stops, because both Pharaoh and Israel don't understand this wonderful line from Isaiah, which, by the way, we read in the Lech Lecha Haftarah each year. If you'd like to read.
Why do you say, O Jacob? Why declare, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, my cause is ignored by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is God from of old, creator of the earth from end to end. He never grows faint or weary. His wisdom cannot be fathomed. He gives strength to the weary, fresh vigor to the spent.
Anoten la'ayev koach, right? He gives strength to the weary. It's what we say each morning in our morning brachot, right? It comes from this line. And the idea here is this summation. You don't understand. Why do you say God ignores you? God doesn't see your trouble. Of course God sees your trouble. God is from the ends of time. God is from of old. Have you heard? Your ancestors told you what God had promised. And God will give you strength. You may feel exhausted now. That will go away. But you got to take that step.
But they haven't stood in front of the mountain yet. They haven't seen God
No.
come down. They have no real experience of what God could or could not have done. This is very early.
But they know secondhand what God did for Abraham, what God did for Isaac, and
And for
what
them,
God
he took them into
and
Egypt
what God
and
did
made
for
them slaves.
Well, he took them to Egypt and saved them from famine,
Well, that's true.
right? He took them to Egypt and saved them
Oh,
from
yeah.
famine.
Be careful
Gave
what
him
you
a
wish for.
good piece of land.
Be
And
careful what you wish for.
absolutely. All right. So our last two quotes.
It seems to me that the story from the start to this point
That means the start of the parasha to where Moses is talking to the people.
doesn't mention Pharaoh sending them from the land at all.
All right. So you can go check that if you like, right? But from verse 2 all the way through to where we find out about their shortness of spirit in verse 9, it doesn't say, I will make Pharaoh let you go.
Oh.
It's Moses coming back second time, right? And saying, God will take you out. God will make you his people. God will give you the land. It's these promises of redemption. Boom, 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 boom. And Pharaoh doesn't get mentioned in this version at all. And the people won't listen to that. And only after that does Moses go to Pharaoh.
Right. It seems God wants them to leave on their own without the king's permission. Even though Moses had already talked to Pharaoh, God wanted them to leave against Pharaoh's will.
Yes, against Pharaoh's will, exactly. So what Kli Yakar is trying to say here is you have to divide this up into two pieces, this section. The first section was to the people, and God was not reiterating the promise. He was making the promise a demand, which is get up and go, right? I've got you. I don't need to convince Pharaoh. If I can convince you, that's enough, right? You can just get up and go. And you're going to say, oh, but the Pharaoh's going to chase us. Yeah, guess what happens later on in the story? Pharaoh chases us after he let us go, and God takes care of us. God could have taken care of us without Pharaoh having let us go in the first place if we had been willing to go. If we hadn't had Kotzer ruach, if we hadn't had that short spirit, we could have left without the plagues. We could have left without the extra suffering for us and for the Egyptians throughout that all intervening time, without all the time in the middle.
Yeah.
And I've got, thick lips sometimes too. And without all that time in the middle, we could have been out of there. But we didn't.
But they had to believe.
Exactly. And that's what Kli Yakar brings, I think, is so beautiful. That's the ultimate problem with the Kotzer ruach, is they were waiting for Pharaoh to let them go. They were waiting for someone else to give them their freedom. They were waiting for someone else to redeem them. And God's saying, I'm God. I'm redeeming you. You don't have to wait for Pharaoh. You don't have to wait for Moses. I have made this promise to you. This is what the world is. Get up and go.
All of a sudden, what's running through my head is the song from Prince of Egypt,
Mhm.
When You Believe.
Yeah, when you believe, exactly. Which is why Rashi finishes up when the very end of what we read, when God tells Moses, this is what you'll say to Pharaoh and this is what you'll say to the people. We have a slightly different attitude that's being presented here.
Moses and Aaron were instructed to lead the people sensitively and put up with them and speak to Pharaoh respectfully.
Okay, so basically what Rashi is saying is here, both the people and the people and Pharaoh failed. All right, test one, they failed. And Moses and Aaron probably were willing to pack it in right then. And God said, no, we're not giving up on this. You're going to have to still be patient with the people. You can go back and you can yell at them and shout at them and curse them and call them all sorts of horrible things. Moses eventually does that and gets in big trouble for it. But even though they could have walked out right here and now and been liberated, Moses has to go back and still treat them with kindness, treat them with sensitivity, be patient with them, not have his own Kotzer ruach, because this is what is still needed. And that is an incredible message for anyone who's ever worked in a frustrating situation, whether it be family, business, community, or anything else. Just because they didn't do what was right or what you thought was right at the moment doesn't mean you take your ball and go home. Because ultimately, it's more important than getting your way is achieving the goal. And that is hard sometimes to swallow, especially when people didn't even notice all they had to do was walk and it would have been done already. But they didn't, so we go to plan B.
It's almost like Moses' perspective is just the opposite of that. If Pharaoh didn't listen, why should Israel?
Yeah, why not? And God is saying, get over yourself.
Right.
Get over the setback, because there's no setback. I am eternal. I've been waiting since the beginning of time for this moment. You can wait a little longer too. And what's important isn't that we force them to leave. What's important is that they properly leave, that they have the right spirit when they set foot outside the land of Egypt, because that's what's going to have to maintain them year after year after century until now and on into the future. So take a deep breath, Moses, and get back in the game. We still have another down, right?
Here it says about Aaron
Mhm.
being mentioned here for two reasons. Act as he was a spokesman
Mhm.
and thereby upset Moses' disability.
You know, Moses is still
It
worried.
didn't help.
Well, it didn't help because it wasn't the disability that was the problem, but it made Moses feel better, right? If Moses had had the most perfectly eloquent delivery, it still would have been just at this point, because the people were stunted in spirit more than his tongue was stunted. But Moses doesn't understand that, and he needs the reassurance too. He's human. And so God gives him Aaron and says, if just in case you think the big problem here is you're not eloquent enough, here's your brother. He's eloquent plenty. You're still going to fail until we go through the hard way. So don't feel bad about yourself and don't give up. And that's the good way to finish. Don't feel bad about yourself and don't give up. Remember that.
Mhm.